Good afternoon. It's good to see you all. My name is Greg Niemeyer. I'm so thrilled to welcome you to the BAM PFA Theater, Osher Theater, to the Big Ideas course. And I want to thank Letters and Sciences and Arts and Design for supporting this special course and public lecture series in which we have wonderful guest speakers to speak about the creative horizontal, the idea that in every discipline, creativity plays a pivotal role. And I'm really thrilled today to invite my dear friend and a constant source of inspiration and absolute art and architecture hero and colleague at UC Berkeley, Ronald Rael, to speak to us today. But before we go into that, I have a couple of announcements I want to make. Number one, I wanted to acknowledge Michael K. Williams, who passed away. And this is a beautiful painting made by Natrice Gaskins. And it's actually made with machine learning, so that there was a photograph at the base of it, and the machine learning figured out with lots of settings and lots of programming from the author, how to turn the photograph into a painting. And sometimes it turns out one way, sometimes it turns out another way, but this painting really stopped me in my tracks, and I thought it was so beautiful and such a wonderful way to create a memorial for somebody who passed away way too soon. And so rest in peace, Michael K. Williams. And with that, we move on to our lecture series. Grace O'Connell spoke last time. Today it's Ronald Rael, and he's going to talk about a wide range of projects that he created. And for us in the course, the assignment is to create a portal, because many of Ron's works are portals. And in that context, I want to mention that also as part of this course offering, we can go to see Shimon Addy's project Night Watch at Minnesota Street Project on September 18th. And so I want to invite you all to join me in the screening of a video about this wonderful project where there's a barge, and on the barge there's photographs of people who are migrants and who had to cross oceans in order to get to safety, often at great peril. And there's a lot more information about this. But anyways, Minnesota Street Project is hosting this in San Francisco, and there's going to be a public lecture, and there's going to be a marching band that marches from Minnesota Street Project down to the water to go to the barge and watch the installation of these amazing photographs. So if you want to do this, it's not mandatory, but it's essential that you go see the world and check out art in San Francisco. Maybe at the same time as you're checking out Ron's show in SF MoMA, which you have tickets for. Oh, a quick raise of hand. Who went to see the show at SF MoMA already? So 2, 3, 4, okay. And so there'll be more after this talk, but okay. So maybe you can combine it. You can combine this trip with the museum trip, and we'll all see each other there. It'll be a lot of fun. So Shimon Addy, Night Watch, September 18th in the evening, 6 to 9 p.m. It's a little hard to get to by public transit, but a short ride from BART to there will work. So yeah, maybe we'll see you there. Marching band always sounds good to me. So now Professor Ronald Rael is a professor of architecture. He's the co-founder of a studio, Rael San Fratello, with his wonderful wife, Virigina San Fratello, and they have a project called Emerging Objects as well. These are all great links to follow. And he's the author of a very important book called Border Wall as Architecture, a book that reimagined the division of the border wall as a site for meaningful architecture. And it's subtitled A Manifesto for the US-Mexico Boundary. And this book was published about 10 years ago and is the source of inspiration for the famous teeter-totter, which you might have seen on TED Talk or on Instagram, and which has been exhibited around the world. And of course now is at SF MoMA as well. Professor Ronald Rael started his career as a Master of Architecture from Columbia University, and he is really a specialist in additive manufacturing, meaning that we use materials that are fluid at one point to get them into a 3D printer and then squeeze them out onto in layers, so that they can stack up and dry and harden into more complex structures. I'm sure he's going to talk a lot more about that. So we already mentioned the current show at SF MoMA, Drawing the Line. Please do check that out. And one thing I find really exciting about his work is that it always is material work. It's a physical practice, but it always leads to conceptual transformations. And so the conceptual transformation and the material innovation are tied. and they feed each other and they leverage each other. And sometimes a practice leads to an idea, and sometimes an idea leads to a practice. And this back and forth is another way of going on and off that creative bridge that we talked about, of seeing how an idea plays out in reality. And with that, here's a new portal, and here's the border wall. And with that, I'd like you to join me in welcoming Professor Ronald Rael. You can escape out of this. Thank you so much. All right, onward. All right.
So Professor Niermeyer asked me to come in to talk about new ways of building. And I'm going to frame that conversation by thinking about old ways of building, which I do quite a bit, and the place in which we might build. Most of the work I'm going to show you, in fact, all of the work I'm going to show you, has its conceptual origins, at least in a very special place that for me has redefined the way we think about the borderlands. It's a high alpine desert, 8,000 feet above sea level, called the San Luis Valley, and it spans the border between Colorado and northern New Mexico. And it's also bordered by 14 and 13,000 foot mountains. But historically, this place from where my family has been from for thousands of years was the northernmost frontier of Mexico until 1848. Then the border was the Arkansas River and extended upwards and across all the way through California. And this site, this valley, is also the headwaters of the Rio Grande River, the Rio Bravo, which defines the border between the United States and Mexico today. And in this special place in Colorado, we see the history of the way that people built previously. Houses made out of mud that are very humble. And so it leads me to think about how we might build something new by looking at the past, but by also looking at the materials and resources that are around us in the immediate context. And I'm actively working on the restoration of about 9 of these adobe structures in that place because of my interest in preserving those ways of thinking about building. And I do it through the context of design, and I do it through the context of art. I collaborate in some cases with artists like Chip Thomas, a medical doctor who lives on the Navajo reservation, who's African American, who's also a famous paste-up graffiti artist and photographer, who posted a scan of a document that documented indigenous slaves who were held at this house in the late 1800s. And here you see he did that both on the interior and the exterior to bring out the history, to build a way of understanding the history of a place that might be invisible. My own home, which was built by my great-grandfather's sister family, is a place that I use to teach traditional and indigenous ways of building, with mud specifically, and how we might use the materials of the landscape, adobe, and earth, and straw, and water, to make buildings, to make houses, but also to teach people how to build traditional ovens and remind us of the traditional indigenous ways of cooking. And so I do this all in the context of the place where my family has lived for many generations. But I've also been thinking about how this is an act of building that brings people together in new ways. And so I've started a project called Hornos Tras Fronteras, which is ovens across borders, where I'm building ovens with communities and migrant shelters along the US-Mexico border to build those communities of people coming together from many different countries and who were stuck at the US-Mexico border for a very long time, especially during the previous regime, to help fortify these communities where people can gather around fire and food and break bread together. And this was the topic of a documentary film called Pedacito de la Tierra. And I'll just show you a quick clip.
Como te digo, soy guatemalteco, ya no soy ningún muchacho jovencito. Acostumbramos a hacer pan según la costumbre de nuestro pueblo. Tú me dices si se está viendo, ¿no? Para poner más madera, porque ya estamos close.
What I love about that clip is they ask the nun who is running the shelter in the documentary film, what are you building here? And in back of her, there's the construction of this mud oven happening. But she doesn't answer, we're building a mud oven. What she says, what we're building here is people. We're building we're building humanity. We're rebuilding humanity. We're rebuilding them in terms of people who have gone on tremendous journeys to find a better life and who have suffered traumas. And they're rebuilding them physically and emotionally, spiritually, and coming together to make the rebuilding of a community at that place before they continue on their journey. And I've continued this act of building ovens as a kind of act of resistance in different places. Recently, I was invited to build one of these ovens in the middle of property owned by the Donald Trump Winery in Charlottesville, Virginia, along with other artists who are working on the themes of migration. This enormous table is called the Truth Table by the artist Ana Teresa Fernandez. And my little oven is over here, and I'm still working on it right there. But it's an oven that serves food, cooks food to be served on that truth table. And we built that oven using bricks from a Mexican-American schoolhouse in Colorado that we sent to Charlottesville, Virginia, as a kind of oven of truth, where communities there could gather around. And from that Trump winery atop of that hill, you could look upon this place that speaks truth to their neighbors about the way communities can be formed in that particular environment. This place in Colorado is interesting because it's a hybrid place, and we could build thinking about hybrids. Along the US-Mexico border prior to 1848, just like today, there was a militarization of that border. And you could see US forts made in the same way that buildings had been built in the region for thousands of years. This is Taos Pueblo, just on the other side of that historic border, which was built over 1,000 years ago. And that US fort, built in the 1800s, was built the same way, out of mud and logs in a very simple fashion, but in a hybrid way where it was built by a different culture. And it's those borderlands that I think are interesting because it's the convergence of people with different beliefs, different foods, different languages. And what happens is that when different things come together, they sometimes mix in really interesting ways, sometimes funny ways, sometimes violent ways, sometimes ridiculous ways. Like the moment that 1,000-year-old house in Taos Pueblo became a tourist attraction and was inundated by those coming from the East Coast and were kind of exoticizing these places, which continues today. And today, not a lot of people live in Taos Pueblo anymore, and those traditions are dying. But new things are born from it. And those memories of these conflations of differences sometimes remain, especially in those ways that are tragic. So, for example, along that Colorado-New Mexico border in 1936, the state of Colorado, by mandate of the governor, declared martial law so that residents of New Mexico could not enter the state of Colorado if they were of indigenous or Hispanic descent. And so Border Patrol, in the form of National Guards, were dispatched to the Colorado-New Mexico border to prevent people from coming in based solely on the way they looked, in a landscape where I actually know people whose house span the border and they sleep in Colorado and they use the bathroom in New Mexico. And those memories have lingered. The leader of the last regime announced one day that they were actively building border wall in Colorado. And I was wondering, where exactly were they building that border wall in Colorado? Was it around the state of New Mexico? I wasn't exactly sure. But those hybrids of building are really interesting in that landscape. So for example, a church built in the 1700s out of mud. When the sawmills and trains came in, you have rolled metal roofing, cast bells, milled lumber, lime plaster. And today that church built in the 1700s looks like this, covered in cement plaster in the front, reverted to a way it looked in the 1700s, but the roof is no longer dirt, it's made out of built up asphalt. And there's a funny little door now that is more like something you might buy at Home Depot. And as people began to leave these villages, especially in the 40s and 50s, they took the inside of these churches away with them, which were really decorative, and created lowriders. So they took a piece of that culture out into the landscape and hybridized the way we think about making cars to continue kind of that culture. And as more and more people moved to places like New Mexico and Southern Colorado and fantasize and romanticize the idea of adobe houses, different kinds of vehicles were designed. Vehicles that would consume massive amounts of earth and leave behind in their wake tens of thousands of adobe bricks so that wealthy people coming to that landscape could build houses within a capitalist economy of construction and displacing the way that people have built for thousands of years in that same region. And so those ideas of hybrids are dotted all over this building, built in the 1400s and discovered and wanted to be preserved. And then this result now, if you've ever visited Casa Grande in Arizona, in 1926, this shelter was built over it, and the idea of the shelter was that it would stand apart from the building so that you could appreciate the structure from the 1400s. But what I love about this building is that it's really a singular expression of design, blending historic and indigenous and traditional with new and contemporary and modern in a way that's peculiar and odd and becomes something else. And so I've taken on that idea of hybrid in my practice, in ways of looking at the past and looking at the future simultaneously, in different ways of thinking about how we might build in new ways. The first adobe house built in Marfa, Texas in over 100 years is a house we designed for someone who was displaced by Hurricane Katrina and wanted to build their own house. But it's a house that blends together concrete and mud in novel ways to have big expanses of spaces on the inside and light, even though there's not a lot of windows on the house. But one way we think about this conceptually is within the archaeology of the house, or the future archaeology of the house. And what I mean by that is that someday this is going to be ruined. An archaeologist might look at it and say, what were people thinking when they made this house? What was culture like? The bottom of the house is made out of mud bricks from the United States that were made in New Mexico, and they're stronger, they're more expensive, and the ones on top have a lighter color. They were made in Ojinaga, Mexico. They're less expensive, but not as strong, so that's why we put them at the top. So there was kind of a cost saving that you can see in the actual structure and tectonic of the architecture itself. And even things like plumbing and the sinks and toilets, they're all housed in a box surrounded by this bigger mud box, and we call it the box house. And it's a house just made out of mud. The outside is mud, the bricks are mud, the inside is plastered with mud, mixed with straw and the mucilage of cactus, which is a traditional way of making earthen plaster. While we were working on this project, we were asked to collaborate with the artists Elm, Green, and Dragset on a project that hybridized concepts in architecture that I hadn't thought about previously. The political dimension of architecture, or politics connected with architecture. It was a project that combined and hybridized the way we also think about art, or the distinctions between art and architecture, or sculpture and architecture. And so it draws that line not only between those, but also between wealth and poverty in the region, between what is Mexican and what is American in the region, wealth and poverty. And so it's a building that houses the 2004 line of shoes and purses produced by Prada, which cost over $1,000 a pair, in a landscape where the traditional shoe was made out of yucca fiber, and that's what that shoe looked like. But it's also a landscape where people walk hundreds of miles until their own shoes wear out, and they stick the fibers of yucca in their shoes so they can go a few more miles. So there's these dichotomies present in this exploration of the structure. It was inspired by this photograph by the photographer Andreas Gursky called Prada, which shows the facade of a Prada store in Milan that has yet to be filled with goods. And this is what that building looks like, called Prada Marfa. You can't go in, it's sealed, it's in the middle of the desert, in the middle of nowhere, alongside a road. And in the archaeology of that house, we also explored the way that building took place after the US-Mexican-American War, in which soldiers built barracks out of mud bricks cast in a cementatious mortar. And later the artist Donald Judd built buildings that way in Marfa as well. And what's interesting about that particular hybridization is that when a mud brick is cast in an impermeable bed of cement mortar, it tends to erode faster because the rain will sit on that lip of just like a plate of water and begin to dissolve. And so over time, what will be left is just this like diaphanous vitrine of cement lattice with the mud having dissolved. This building, or this sculpture, however you might consider it, became what was thought of as the first Instagrammable form of art or architecture. Lend mostly to this photograph of Beyonce, who jumped in front of the building and posted it to her Instagram account. And then everyone who'd go to Prada Marfa and made that pilgrimage would do the same thing. And so it made me start to think about how what we create in the world can become cultural objects, objects that have larger ramifications and connection to a larger kind of culture. In fact, just a couple of summers ago, the Simpsons took a road trip and they too visited Prada Marfa, not because they were necessarily so interested in the politics and complexity of the work, but mostly because Homer had to take a leak behind the building. While we were working on that project in 2004, we are beginning to see the heightened awareness of a governmental perception to increase security along the US-Mexico border, which eventually led to the 2006 Secure Fence Act, which mandated the construction of 800 miles of wall be built along the US-Mexico border. And since 2006, 3.4 billion has been spent. I think that number is actually much higher since I last gave this lecture. But to complete that project, it will require $49 billion from 2006 in the next 25 years to construct and maintain that wall. This is not a wall that was mandated by the previous regime, even though that regime leader demanded that what he would promise was the construction of a wall and built very few. This was a wall that was put in place by the George Bush administration and continues to be built today. So that $49 billion is that which is underway already and which is a law called the 2006 Secure Fence Act. It's not considering the 70 billion that was proposed by the previous regime leader and what that wall would cost, which did not get constructed. But I'd like to think about that question, what $49 billion could buy. And just to give you an example, it could buy 300 Seattle public libraries, or 204 Disney concert halls, or 500 miles of the High Line, if you're familiar with that linear park in Manhattan. And so imagine that kind of investment taking place along the US-Mexico border instead of the construction of a steel and concrete wall. So that wall is a form of architecture, I think, because it's designed and it's constructed by the Army Corps of Engineers and by a research laboratory called Fence Lab at Los Alamos National Laboratory and Texas A&M University. And the way they would test this wall is they would load a vehicle with, I think, 40,000 pounds and ram it into the wall at 50 miles an hour to demonstrate its permeability. And they'd spend millions of dollars doing this research. And just like every research which becomes a form of, let's say, war, I think this is a kind of defensive strategy against a certain kind of war on, whether you see that narrative as being a war on drugs, as it was, a war on terrorism, is the point where the Secure Fence Act was passed, or today a war on immigration. There is research being done on the other side of that. Think about how you overcome those walls. And so, for example, some of the research done at very little cost is just ways to find portable bridges that one can just bring up to the wall and drive vehicles right over it. Sometimes those research experiments are successful, sometimes they're a failure, but in many cases it points out the ridiculousness of the wall and its construction, and how easily someone can think about how millions or billions of dollars can be put towards an effort that can simply become breached by a little bit of ingenuity. Now, one other consideration of the construction of that wall is that since 1994, more than 6,000 people have died trying to cross that border because the wall pushes people to further extremes in the desert, leading to dehydration and death. And when that law was passed, over 30 other laws were waived for its construction. That 2006 Secure Fence Act became one of the highest laws in the land, usurping Environmental Protection Acts, Native American Heritage Acts, Wilderness Acts. Nothing could stop the construction of that wall, and that's why you've probably seen in the news entire mountains in wildernesses being blown up for the construction of a steel wall through those landscapes. Or you've seen walls constructed through Native American reservations right over and atop the graves of the people who have lived there for thousands of years. In one case, the Army Corps of Engineers proposed that the wall cut through the University of Brownsville at Texas campus. And the proposition included that students would have to show their passport as they moved across that wall to go from classroom to classroom. Imagine if that was your experience. But despite the intention of walls to keep people apart in a way, it has actually brought people together in some really remarkable ways that demonstrate their resilience and resistance to the division of the wall, like binational yoga classes that have taken place in Friendship Park near Tijuana and San Diego. And what's interesting about all of these stories, and these are stories that I continued to collect and were part of the book that Greg mentioned about border walls architecture, is that I think they combine two particular issues. If we want to look at a kind of dichotomy of the border wall of one side or another, or Mexican American wealth and poverty, I think there is the dichotomy of horror and humor that exists at the border. The horrors of xenophobia, poverty, and the stresses of immigration, but also humor that I have witnessed and seen that has been used as a response to cope with the tragedies of the border, and laid out really remarkably in this National Geographic photograph from the early 1900s that was entirely staged. It's not real, but it shows Border Patrol agents pulling someone back into the United States while his friends are pulling him back into Mexico. As an architect, I have documented or illustrated those stories in the form of drawings and models, which are at the show at the SF MoMA right now, but also board games and maps and things that are much more like souvenirs, recuerdos I call them, objects that will help you remember the time that a border wall was constructed and what a crazy, ridiculous, stupid idea that was. And so during this time, I also illustrated these stories that I found were fascinating, like a Border Patrol agent buying a paleta from a vendor just a foot away from him, but made a federal offense by just a couple of centimeters of steel. Money is exchanged through the wall, food is exchanged through the wall by a federal agent, and it was captured on film, an entirely normal act made illegal by just a single material. And so I created these recuerdos, these snow globes, these souvenirs as a way to remember the time that food and ideas were shared through that wall. Or imagining that if the wall is a barrier to the north-south movement, then perhaps what if it can actually facilitate east-west movement through cities through the form of pedestrian and bicycle paths? When I imagined this binational library, I imagined that there are ways that we might begin to conceptually dismantle this wall before we actually physically dismantle it by imagining its other state, its other life, a time when the border wall itself is nothing more than a shelf that holds books and information, ideas, and knowledge could be shared across that divide. A binational theater where if we think of, which I do, that the wall is nothing more than political theater, then we should invite audiences to witness that act. And in fact, that's been a big part of this work because we recognize that at least 1/2 of the population of the United States did not know that a wall was already in place along the US-Mexico border when they voted for the leader of the previous regime. A swing wall in which one sits in and can travel over to the other side until gravity deports them back to their country of origin. And so this is what the wall looks like today, where someone is mowing their lawn in their backyard, a yard that's defined by the wall itself. And on the other side, the wall is actually the fourth wall of someone's home. Because that wall doesn't only divide nations, it divides cities, it divides neighborhoods, it divides families. And one thing you'll see in the exhibition is a series of blueprints that we did, imagining this idea of the wall cutting through someone's home and someone's family. And in this drawing, the wall is cutting through the bed in the bedroom. And what you see on the right is the typical size of a house in El Paso, Texas. And on the left, the typical size of a house in Juarez, Mexico. And those are the stories that you'll find in this book, Border Wall as Architecture, and the illustrations. when I was beginning that book, I was starting research on, I was ending research on another topic of earth and architecture, like adobes and things like that. And one of the architects who was very famous for building with earth was an Egyptian architect named Hassan Fathy. And it became kind of the premise of the book Border Walls Architecture, that architects do not design walls, but the spaces between them. And so I thought it very important that to understand that within that book, that I am not designing walls, nor should architects design walls, but we should be very careful about the spaces that walls define. And that if we are to think about being designers and architects and artists, people who engage landscapes and spaces, that perhaps we should be thinking very carefully about the spaces that the wall and the people that the wall are putting in danger today. That book I was talking about is called Earth Architecture, and it has also led to a body of research that's very connected. That book is about modernity in earth architecture. I showed some historic examples of buildings made of earth, but there are countless buildings being built today, museums, airports, embassies, that are also made out of mud, out of dirt. But I also wondered what the future of earth architecture might be. And at that time, 12 years ago, I thought, well, maybe it's 3D printing. And I wanted to start that project to think about what does it mean to 3D print with mud? And that project is called Emerging Objects. And so when I became a professor here at Berkeley, I discovered this magazine article that had just come out. It's 40 things you need to know about the next 40 years. And the number one thing on the list of that magazine is that sophisticated buildings will be made of mud. And that was really encouraging for me to think, well, maybe that sophistication can become through a kind of hybridized technology of bringing the old and new together. That was written by Smithsonian Magazine on their anniversary issue. But I also thought it interesting that the number one thing you need to know about the last 10,000 years is that sophisticated buildings were made out of mud. And that was told to us by civilization itself, who invented that technology and has been working on it for 10,000 years. So I embarked in thinking about how we could take clay and put it in a 3D printer, how we could take man's oldest additive manufacturing endeavor of taking mud and sticking it together and growing it to become an object, which lasts 30,000 years and more, and using it in a digital environment to make digital objects that become physical. And these are some of the first 3D printed clay objects in the world that were made here at Berkeley in my lab in the architecture department. Very thin mud structures that led us to fire them in the kiln to make ceramic objects, and opened up a whole series of speculations, like what do you do with that? Do you make new kinds of bricks that might hold plants or water or insulation? Do you imagine new possibilities for cooling buildings, like looking at the past again and looking at these methods for cooling spaces in dry climates where you place a ceramic vessel filled with water that's porous, and as that evaporates and warm, dry air is pushed over it, it humidifies that air and lowers the temperature within a room. That's still used today all over the world, in India, in the Middle East, in North Africa, in Southern Europe, in Spain. And how that could be a single building module? Because we discovered that we can 3D print bricks with very high porosity that absorb water like a sponge. And when the brick absorbs water and warm, dry air passes through it, it can actually cool the temperature of a building inside. So this is, we call the cool brick. And it was designed in such a way that the mortar could stick within these membranes in a way that a normal brick couldn't, but air could pass through it. And these are prototypes of that cool brick. So these kinds of inventions are something that we've been working on over and over, and imagining what the power of a new technology can bring to an old technology to create a new way of building. So not only the making of shapes or forms is part of it, but the way that a machine can lay down the material itself. And 6 years ago, we invented a way of printing clay that has really taken over the ceramics world lately. It's just a way of depositing the material itself to make objects like this, or like this, which we did not know what that was good for, but there was a novelty to it that was pretty exciting, because we ended up making objects like this, that was sort of much more like weaving than it was printing, that it really challenged the notion of layers and took on the pieces of reality that were missing from the translation from the virtual world to the physical world, that denied gravity or accepted gravity or the plasticity of a material, that we can make textures and patterns out of a material that could last 100,000 years, that was non-toxic, and that was waterproof. And what does that mean for architecture? So all these experiments we sort of saved, these were just like lab tests in some ways, but they were artful at the same time. And so again, in some ways, science and mathematics and art came together and started to think about that in relationship to architecture. How can we make walls or surfaces or claddings or bricks that took on those same kind of textures and patterns, and what might they be good for? We also looked more broadly. So not only Earth, but what else could we throw in that 3D printer? Here in the Bay Area, there are hundreds of thousands of tons of salt produced in the salt crystallization ponds in the South Bay. You might see them when you fly into San Francisco or Oakland. But it's a material that is extremely inexpensive and is made using only sun and wind and the harvesting of water. And we invented a material that uses salt as an additive manufacturing material that has structural capabilities. Because of its low cost, we could start to aggregate it and imagine what kinds of buildings could be made, or facades or walls, using salt as a material. And so we did a small experiment imagining what would it mean to be inspired by building from the landscape around you, like an igloo. And so we did a project called the Salt Igloo, because ours is made out of salt igloo. You like that one? But every brick was different. And it took on the challenges of what can a 3D printer make and how fast could it make? And we made a lightweight salt tent that we call the Salt Igloo, held together in tension with lightweight aluminum rods. Each block is bound to each other in compression. And we kept exploring. What about all the sawdust produced from the sawmills in the Sierra Nevadas? Could we take the 9 million tons of waste that are produced in the United States each year in the construction industry, that start with forests and then are cut smaller into logs and then into timber and ultimately to sawdust, and reverse that, not from a subtractive process to an additive process, where we're building up that sawdust to make viable wood construction products out of sawdust? And these are some of our experiments. And we, last year in October, formed a company called Forest, and we are now manufacturing wood products out of sawdust using additive manufacturing. And you can find that at forest.com. We spell forest with a U, because we think the forests are for all of us, and we want to preserve the way we think about timber harvesting around the world. Cement is something that is ubiquitous in architecture. This building is made out of cement and concrete, and we developed novel ways to 3D print with cement that don't require any molds or formwork. And these are some of the larger structures that we made here, and you can see we're doing this here on campus, 3D printing cement blocks using very little water and no molds. And we're also always thinking about how our forms and our spaces are just looking back and learning from the traditions that came prior to us, the structural forms, the shapes, even the possibility for imagining forms of beauty that were unimaginable previously, or that were imagined but now expressed through a new form of media. So all of those curvy clay things that we made were discovered by some scientists at the California Academy of Sciences, because they saw that as ideal habitat for coral reproduction. And so we began to work with this nonprofit organization called Secor, which had a really interesting way to think about preserving or let's say restarting coral reefs around the world through sexual coral reproduction and the preserving of a habitat for coral larvae, which actually mate once a year. And they came to us first because they asked us if we can make some objects using calcium carbonate, which corals secrete. And they had scanned coral reefs around the world, and they wanted to use it at the Academy of Sciences to show the public how the increased pH of the ocean due to climate change has a degrading acidic effect on the calcium carbonate coral. And so we had made this calcium carbonate coral to show that, and they'll put that in a higher pH water and they'll show how it begins to degrade rather than the typical ocean pH. But when they're in our laboratory, they saw all of these curvy, weavy things, and we told them that that's ceramic, and they had been working for a number of years with flat ceramic pieces and demonstrating that larvae like to attach to ceramic, but they need places to hide in and places to nestle in, and they need light and dark spaces, and they needed a way that scuba divers could go down and anchor these kind of little egg hatcheries to the ocean bottom, or ways that they could be packed together and dumped off a boat. And so we spent several months designing with them these 3D printed ceramic units in different ways, different forms that supported coral habitat and could be moved around and jostled by the waves and wouldn't disrupt their own habitat. And now they're being tested all over the world, and we made more than 4,000 of them. And there's a goal that if the tests are successful, which they're demonstrating to be, that we would print over 1 million of these and continue to deposit these in oceans around the world. And so there's a lot of energy going into testing them in Curacao, in Australia, in Baja California, and Guam. And so we're really excited about the possibility that we are making these experiments, which blended science and art, into pragmatic and engineered and useful designed objects that have a positive effect on our global landscape. So it's not only animal habitat that we're looking at, but we're looking at architecture and human habitat. And several years ago, the East Bay relaxed their building and zoning regulations such that a homeowner did not need to go before an architect or before the planning board to make a house in their backyard, as long as it was under 1,200 square feet. And so we thought this was an excellent opportunity to test our material processes in the form of a house that responded to that relaxation, which had to do with the lack of housing in the East Bay. And so we just took all of our experiments together to say, okay, what does it mean to 3D print the cladding of the building? Using that technique that we had to make it look handmade, to attach on a 3D printed surface, on a surface that was waterproof and resilient and could last 100,000 years. What would it mean to make another facade of that building in a way that used recycled sawdust, used our cement, and also used recycled Chardonnay grape skins from the wineries in Napa and Sonoma, and could hold and house succulents and air plants that thrive very well in the Northern California climate. That house, this is a photo not taken too long ago, it's just become its own kind of ecology and is really thriving as a house that's part of the landscape itself. The interior of the house is made with a bioplastic made from corn and hemp and bamboo, and it's translucent. So we have the ability to calibrate the house as a lantern itself and the spaces and environments on the inside, setting different kinds of moods during the day and night and evening. And the entire surface is 3D printed, so every panel is different, and it draws from the traditions of pressed tin, where you have a pattern and you press it over and over and over again, and you make thousands of the same. But in this case, we're making thousands of difference. The furniture is also 3D printed, the tables, the chairs, experiments in just making different components of a kind of micro house, and imagining the possibility for that house to change and transform throughout the day and night to accommodate a new way of living within a new way of building. So often these things seem diametrically, well, not diametrically opposed, they seem just very different, 3D printing and work on the border, even though I'm arguing they come from the same place, a place where I learned how to make mud bricks out of the land around us, and a way to think about how we can 3D print components made out of materials that are around us, and a way of thinking about making new connections across a border in a place that's been divided by looking at the hybrid that emerges from that landscape. But could this research all become borderless as well? Could we begin to blend 3D printing and additive manufacturing? That's been a recent exploration of ours. And explored this in different ways. Something called Hakal Digital, which looks at this traditional way of building, which is called a Hakal, where you have woven branches or sticks and then it's plastered with mud. This is a way of building around the world. London looked like this until the 1600s. But we did this with 3D printing, where we're building the wattle, that woven network of branches with this bioplastic, and then we're covering it with locally sourced clay. And that locally sourced clay, when dried, gives it a kind of rigidity that the bioplastic doesn't have. The ultimate structure looks like this as an experiment in a new way of making a building that's hybridized using 3D printing and traditional forms of construction. And we're also thinking about it in the political way as well, that we learned from working on Prada Marfa. And you might remember that at one time, the leader of the previous regime said that there were bad hombres at the border. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. He didn't say they're bad hombres at the border. He said they're bad hombres at the border. And he recognizes that an hombre is this beautiful gradient between shade and light. And that gradient that we find at the border in the world of hairstyle, I think what's on the left is a bad ombre, and maybe that's a good ombre on the right, I don't know. But those kind of gradients are what we find on the borderlands. We find times that there's a strict division between two sides, and sometimes we find that kind of blending that I find to be really fascinating and interesting. So we made these series of objects called bad ombres, which used clays from different states that were democratic and republican, and to think about how we might see those distinct divisions, but we also might see at different scales how there was a blending of those two materials, and that there were lack of distinctions, and that we could find that that's really how people often are. They might be divisive, or they might have different considerations, but these are the bad ombre series that are made of these two different materials. But we thought that maybe it would be more exciting if we went to the US-Mexico border and we took clay from Mexico and clay from the United States to make these kinds of objects. But that led to a whole new way of thinking about making in the borderlands for us, because we decided it wasn't about making the objects again using two different clays, but we invited 25 ceramic artists from El Paso and Juarez, faculty from University of Texas, El Paso in geology and ceramics. And we went around the region on both sides of the border, digging up clays and processing those clays. And we found this amazing range of complexions of clays, from whites to reds to browns to greens, looking at traditional sites of clay production and finding new sites of clay production. Sometimes we're digging in the back of a Subway sandwich shop, and sometimes we're digging in a place where people have dug clay for hundreds of thousands of years, well, not tens of thousands of years. And we created this software app because the ceramic artist knew very well how to craft and mold clay, but they didn't know how to use a 3D printer, and they didn't know how to make a 3D model in the computer. So we made this very simple app where you move around a slider, and it exported a file that you could have in the computer. And it was the same kind of thing that we were doing previously, but we made it available to everybody. We called it Potterware, and now it's being used at universities and high schools all over the world. But our first use of it was there in the borderlands. And those 25 ceramic artists, which we hoped would each make one vessel, ended up making 270 vessels. And they loved it. And these are some examples of those objects that were all made by clays harvested from the borderlands. But our idea had always been, how do we scale up the production of this? How do those experiments become architecture? And could we scale up the machine? Could we scale up this object in spaces? And so that's been our goal over the last 3 years, because this was the endeavor that we wanted to explore. And so first we had to think about a larger machine. And I sent this sketch to a friend who made machines. And I said, can we do this? And he said, yeah. And so he started working on it. We worked on it together, and we came up with this, which was a machine that could print lots of different objects at once, but which could also print one big object. And so now this is for sale, and people could buy this anywhere. And it's like, I don't know, if a KUKA robot costs $100,000, this thing only costs like $20,000. And it's ready to go, where a KUKA, you still need to tell it what to do. You need the space to anchor it to, but this is also portable. we also need to figure out how to pump large amounts of material through a hose. So this is kind of a manual 3D printer right here where we're imagining what it could be made. And we got better and better at pumping material. We got better and better of increasing the strength of the robot. It's kind of loud. And once we were confident that this was possible, we took it back out to the borderlands, this portable robot that we made, and we started a project called Mud Frontiers. The idea that mud is a material, but mud is also about mobility, our ability to go out in the middle of nowhere. It's ubiquity, because it's available everywhere, and it's democracy, that maybe anyone could use this. And for the first time ever in the history of the planet, we're 3D printing mud in the borderlands, where mud has been used as a building material for thousands of years. So I'll tell you about a little bit about these experiments. Because these early experiments were conceptualized around lightness, the fact that earthen buildings are usually really thick and heavy, but we could print like just 3 inches thick because we could corrugate it in a way that gave it added strength. If we think about a flat piece of paper that's all floppy, if we fold that, all of a sudden it's strong. The same as for a mud building. It can be very thin. Also lightness, thinking about how would we illuminate buildings in the middle of nowhere? How did they become beacons? And so this idea of the beacon became an idea for how we might build something like stairs that would be used in a building. Also, how could we fire pottery in kilns that we would 3D print using clay that was harvested in these places? So we worked with indigenous potters in the region who were friends of mine, and we tested those ideas of harvesting traditional clays to print functional pottery that you can actually cook in, and different explorations of structure and form and material that made the building stronger, but also thinking about printing program. And what I mean by program is a place that has a use, a place to sit, a place to gather around a fire, a place to bring people and community together. And so over the pandemic, this became our laboratory. Our laboratory became this site where we started to produce not 3D printed objects that are on the table, like I showed earlier, but 3D printed objects that were spatial in a landscape, that were connected to the landscape in meaningful and historic ways. I'll just go forward. And just experiments that took on a new dimension, ways to think about how could we print a dome, and we were kind of conservative here. Could we print an opening without any kind of support? What does it mean for the light and the form to continue the explorations about the nature of space? How could we print much more quickly using this platform where we could move the robot without having to wait for the mud to dry? How can we create a multicellular space that starts to get like a house is, with different rooms? How can that space be programmed, and what would those programs be? Its use. How do we harvest that material efficiently and effectively in a way that's not damaging to the landscape? And so we worked on this project over the COVID time that we called Casa Covida. Casa meaning house, and Covida meaning cohabitation. It's a house for the habitation of 2 people coming together in this landscape, which is an extension of the borderlands, thinking about how we hybridize building traditions of the past and building traditions of the present and future. We made door handles made out of melted aluminum cans alongside the road. Beetle kill pine harvested from the forests that are being decimated by climate change. Working with traditional weavers and friends who make textiles. Created a place for sleeping, a place for cooking with the pottery. gathering and eating, and a place for bathing, in a place that also has the kind of a sort of space of phenomena and spirituality and connection to place and time and history in a way that technology sometimes removes us from. And so those hybrids continue. What would a roof look like on this? And we had different ideas for it, but what about an inflatable roof that brought a different character of light to the space and play and fun, that protected from the rain, but really transformed the space in a novel way? And so today we're working on a project at the ironically named Frontier Drive-In, and looking at a new frontier of building there at the drive-in, where they're restoring this old drive-in theater. But what we're doing now is we're building the first permitted 3D printed earthen building ever constructed in the world. It'll also be the largest 3D printed earthen building in the world, which is 8 spaces for bathing and watching the stars and skies in the middle of the desert at the Frontier Drive-In. And we're scheduled to complete that. We stopped construction for the season now because I had to come back to Berkeley to teach, but we're going to continue that beginning in May. So this idea of the borderlands and new ways of building are also ways of thinking about how we not only build buildings and people, but how we build new connections. While we were out there in the desert, we were, and this was several years ago, when the news of child separation at the border was at its peak, we were speaking with lots of friends because of our work in the borderlands about the protests that were taking place due to child separation. And we had no way to participate in the protests, but we spent a day or so to make a protest sign, because a friend said we need a sign to take to the protests. And like many people have in the past, we used this sign as something to build upon, because this is an iconic sign in the borderland that speaks to the tragedy of the borderlands. These signs were put up here in California to warn motorists that people brought by traffickers might be dumped off alongside the road and would run across the highway. And so this warned motorists so that they'd be careful not to hit them. But this sign has a really particular history in these expanded borderlands. It was designed by a Navajo graphic designer who's working for the California Department of Transportation. And he was tasked to design this sign. And he saw the plight of the immigrant today as that related to the Navajo, his own people, during the long walk when they were displaced from their own lands and had to migrate to the place where the government had demanded that they go. And so he thought very carefully about the design of the sign. He used a little girl with ponytails because he thought that's who drivers might empathize with the most. And he used the silhouette of the civil rights leader Cesar Chavez as the head of the father in the sign. And so I wanted to build upon what I thought was the genius, the subversive genius of this sign as a form of activism that had infiltrated the California Department of Transportation. And I made one simple move, which was just to turn the family to face each other and use reunite instead of caution, to remind people of the tragedies of child separation that was occurring along the border. And so people were downloading them. We made it open source. People do whatever with them, and they're printing them out. And we made larger signs to place alongside the highway near child detention centers. But this caught the eye of the For Freedoms campaign, which is the largest public art project in the world. And they invited us to bring this sign back to the highway in a way that we would have never expected, which is the form of an enormous digital billboard where hundreds of thousands of people could see and be reminded of that basically we should be building a United States and not a divided states. And this idea of smuggling design into places became an important part of our practice over the last 3 years. And you can now see this sign at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in Manhattan on 110th Street in Amsterdam. And people continue to download this sign. And are installing it all over Los Angeles. And this idea of smuggling is bringing activism into spaces where activism is typically not present, like the facade of the museum of the Johnson Museum in New York, or San Francisco MoMA. It's not that that painting that you'll see at the museum is such a special painting. I did it in the afternoon with a template that I had made on Illustrator and painted by hand. It's what it means, and that it allows people and reminds people when they're at a museum that it's not only about appreciating art, but it's about appreciating the culture that shapes art and the cultural forces that are at play today that separate people and hurt people and kill people. And so this idea of smuggling was within one of the stories of the book Border Walls Architecture, where we could maybe smuggle ideas to the border that would actually build a new way of bringing people together. And that was in the form of a teeter-totter. So one of the illustrations we did, imagine the border as a metaphorical fulcrum between US-Mexico relations, labor balances and trade balances. And so this was the drawing that we created, and this was the model that we created, which you can see there also. But it resonated with people so much that we began to imagine this becoming a reality. And we made several propositions for it, working with art organizations along the border. But the Department of Homeland Security and Border Patrol always said, no way can you do this. We will not allow this. But because we had taken it to this point, or arts organizations brought us to this point where we could imagine its reality, we decided that we wanted to just see the objects built in the world at full scale and to imagine what it would be like to actually do this. We had no plans to actually do it, but we wanted to imagine what would it take to actually do this? How would you slide a teeter-totter through the wall? How would it connect to the wall? How would you install the seats on each side? How would you enact that event? We actually went to the border and we would carry large objects on the US side and wait to see how long it took for US Border Patrol to arrive and what they would tell us. And we did the same on the Mexican side to see how long US Border Patrol would take to arrive there. So we acted it all out. We knew precisely what that meant. And we had it fabricated in Juarez by some friends who owned a metal fabrication shop. This is kind of the first test ride of that teeter-totter. And we worked with an arts organization there in Juarez called Colectivo Chopeque, who, what they primarily do is they build housing for the poor in Juarez. But we worked with them to imagine this scenario of not a metaphorical fulcrum, but a literal fulcrum that spoke to the relationships that people could have across that divide. And that this fulcrum became the way we could smuggle design into this context to tell a bigger story about US-Mexico relationships and the relationships between people. When we decided a color, we thought it was interesting that we were making the teeter-totter itself out of the same material that the wall itself was made out of. But rather than the material used to divide people, we were creating the same material used to connect people. And we imagined it standing apart from the wall, that it was bright, and that it had a connotation of a playground equipment, that it was for play, that it was for fun. But we also wanted to remember that this was a site of violence. And in Juarez, the color pink is used very specifically to memorialize women who were killed during the time of violence, the drug violence, when Juarez was the most dangerous city in the world. And then we wanted to remind ourselves that although we were using play as a form of activism, we were using it in a context of violence. We wanted to do this and we were told no, but after increased news of more wall construction and more child separation at the border, there was one day, knowing that these teeter-totters existed in the real world, that we decided that we would just take them down, invite the community, and have an event at the border. And this is what that day looked like. It was a very small event. It only happened for 40 minutes. no one told us to stop. Border Patrol did come in these 8 minutes that we predicted that they would arrive. And later, the Mexican National Guard came heavily armed, and they asked us what we were doing, and we told them that we were having an event with the children, and they allowed us to continue as well. Nobody questioned us, nobody stopped us. The only reason we stopped is because the kids got tired of riding on teeter-totters that day. And what we discovered is that while the US Border Patrol and the Mexican National Guard stood back and stood their ground, that the space itself was owned and defined by the women and children who attended that event that day, that they were in control of that space. And it was a space of joy and connection, and that overrode the space of violence and the policing of that space that is typical. We did not know that it would have such an impact that it did around the world because it was such a small event. But I think what people saw was that there's a different narrative that exists at the border. That the border isn't a place where no one lives in the middle of the desert and bad men are doing bad things, but it's a place where women and children live every day and they can experience joy despite the oppression of the wall. And so when we talk about new ways of building, I think we can talk about how new ways of building might allow us to think about ways of unbuilding as well. We might be able to build new connections by unbuilding a wall. And that for those 40 minutes, we're also able to show that the actions that take place on one side of that wall have a direct consequence on the other. All right, thank you guys. I think I spoke for a really long time. Maybe if we have questions or how this works, I don't know.
Well, first, thank you for a fabulous talk. And I have a lot of questions, but I want to see if anybody else has any questions you want to jump in with right away. What a beautiful time spent together. And thank you so much for sharing your vision with us. It's really moving. And we'll start right here. And I think Nat's going to help me with the second microphone. Good. For team, thank you.
Hi, going back a bit with mud construction, I want to know what's possible to promote, in which way can everyone contribute, or can we contribute to promote these sustainable practices of going back to mud construction, since I feel I have seen a lot of cultural and social boundaries for the implementation of this good practice.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I might need some help reinterpreting that the question. Maybe I got lost in your thoughts there a little bit.
En español está bien.
Sí, hablo español.
Bueno. He visto como bastante como, pues sí, barreras, en especial socioculturales, a regresar a la construcción con barro.
Oh, okay. So she's asking, what are the barriers to building in mud today? Because there are barriers. There are actually laws in California where you can't build with mud anymore. And so there are not only social and cultural barriers, and I think some of the social and cultural barriers are that people perceive mud as a building material of the poor. And not only do people with money think that that's a material for the poor, but also the poor think it's a building material of the poor. And so sometimes when one wants to promote the continued use of building with mud, the people who live in buildings made of mud don't want that anymore. I know my mother grew up in a house made out of mud, and she thinks I'm crazy because I love building with mud so much. She doesn't want it because she says that's for the poor. And I've experienced that all over the world when I've proposed and designed schools made out of mud. I'd like to think that it's that hybrid that can transcend those barriers, that we can as designers, think about how that building material, which we have used for 10,000 years, can exist to accommodate our modern ways of living. Because while many of you, I bet while most of you may have never been in a building made of mud, and you might think it's odd or weird, you have to remember that for the last 10,000 years of human existence, your ancestors lived in buildings made of mud. And when you get a chance to go in one and to sleep in one, you will say to yourself, this makes sense, because you all evolved as humans to actually make those buildings. I believe you look the way you do, and we have these things, and we have arms and our musculature and everything, because that's what we did. And so I think one of the barriers is we have to recognize that this is what we do as humans. We live in that connection with the earth in metaphorical ways and in actual physical ways.
Cool. Question up there?
Thank you so much for the really amazing presentation. I'm an architecture student, and I was fascinated by the potential of 3D printers. And with my knowledge, I feel like it's a really slow process, and it's really expensive to make one thing. That's what I know right now. But do you, how much potential do you seek in 3D printers, and how broadly used do you think in the future, and how efficient is it right now, and do you think it's going to improve?
Yeah, I think it's improving all the time, but my hope is that it improves outside the context of plastic, right? And so a plastic object like this is going to take a really long time, and it's going to be really slow, and ultimately it's made out of plastic, which is an enormous environmental problem. Whereas an object like this is like a 20-minute object, and once it's fired, it's going to last thousands of years potentially, and it's non-toxic, and it returns back to the earth ultimately. And so and it's free, because you can dig it up out of the ground, you can dig the clay, or if you go to the store and buy clay, also you get like 50 pounds for $10. And so for me, I think the potential is not looking like when this new technology arrived called a 3D printer, and it had all this promise of the future, we started using materials that demonstrated to us 150 years ago all the problems that laid in its path, like concrete and plastic, right? And so I think the potential of the future is not to use concrete and plastic, which everybody's interested in when they think about 3D printers, but those are the materials that we should stay away from, because they don't represent an advancement in thinking. I think actually an advancement in thinking with this new technology is to think about the materials that have had the most longevity on the planet, which is materials that are natural and locally sourced.
Thank you. And I have one more question. I realized you've done so many projects that are like non-profit. So I wanted to know, like, which organizations supported those projects?
Well, that's a good question. Sometimes I pay for them out of pocket. Sometimes I get grants here at the university. Sometimes I work with nonprofit organizations like Alight, which they're called Alight now, but they used to be called the American Refugee Committee. And sometimes I collaborate with industry partners like the 3D printer company, where we've collaborated, we made a design, and they sell the printer now, but I get to have printers. And so there's lots of creative ways that you make an ecosystem of collaboration to do the work. And sometimes communities have a little bit of money, and sometimes museums buy your drawings, and then you can put that back into the work. And so there's lots of ways. I think what I have found is, as a person who makes things in the world, that sometimes you can think, okay, I have to wait to make something until someone wants something. But if you just make because it's in you to make, that those things you make will find a home in the world because someone wants those ideas that you're making. At least that's my belief and my experience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's some questions in the Zoom room. that we'd like to forward to you. And so Jacqueline is going to read that. I think I interpreted your signs correctly, did I?
Yeah.
Okay, good. There was a lot of gesturing and pointing, and now we're good. Okay, good.
The question is, are there any valid concerns when it comes to building with clay, adobe, and brick? And what are the modern chemical advancements with these building materials?
Are there any advancements or concerns? Like some of the concerns have to do with earthquakes. And there have been plenty of advancements around the world on building with earth and earthquakes, ways to stabilize in really ingenious ways using reinforcement that happen at the layer of each brick. And if we think about seismic zones like in California, where you cannot build in adobe, the oldest buildings in California are made out of adobe, and they're still standing. And so I think we have to think about how technologically we can transform those building systems in order to accommodate particular issues like seismic loads in earthquake zones. There are issues related to insulation. And so there are building codes passed about insulation, and adobe and earth has no insulation, but it operates really effectively. It's what's called a thermal mass. So rather than buffering heat or holding back heat and holding back cold like a thermos and counting that as an efficiency, instead it operates in a way that absorbs heat and it absorbs cool and releases that in a way that's quite different. And so there just needs to be, again, to cross these barriers, a kind of understanding of the performance of the material that's very different than the way that people who make and sell materials want their performance to be measured. And then the second part of the question I forgot.
About modern chemical advancements with these building materials. I think maybe he's speaking about like your mix, the hybrid materials and the plastics and the glue and salt. Like was also curious about those.
Yeah, so in a lot of those material mixtures are similar, but I'll talk about the wood one a little bit, which is that it's sawdust and it's mixed with like a natural glue. You could actually, if you wanted to eat sawdust, and sometimes people put sawdust in bread mixtures, but if you wanted to eat the 3D print, you could. And then we use a polymer that was invented here at Berkeley that comes from, so it's a biodegradable low VOC, volatile organic compound polymer that's made out of recycled sawdust also. So it like perpetuates the story of like everything we're using comes from sawdust to protect it. And all wood furniture have some kind of polymer. I don't know if this doesn't look like wood, but you'll see it all has some kind of coating that protects it. And so we use that same coating, but it's a coating that was invented here that's super eco. Yeah. Thanks for those Zoom questions.
Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. My question was, is there a specific experience that made you appreciate and realize the potential of mud homes?
Yeah, my own experience is growing up in them, and that my family lived in a mud home probably for the last 1,000 years. And so that's my experience. When I went to architecture school, I thought buildings were thick and they were made of mud. And then my professors told me, no, that's not, buildings aren't made that way. And so it took a lot of unlearning for me to go through architecture school, and it took a lot of reminding myself that how important those experiences were. And I think that has led to like also a hybrid in my own education. And so what I would remind all of you of is that you all have had special experiences in your own upbringing that you shouldn't discount as you move forward in life.
Thank you.
I just want to echo the sentiment of many of my classmates and say that I really appreciate your presentation. One thing that stood out to me is you're kind of thinking about sustainability in a much broader time frame than most of us usually do. I really love the notion of going back into history in a slower and more intentional way to create something for our future. One thing you mentioned was thinking about the future archaeology of structures and buildings. And so I would love for you to talk a little bit about what you want the future archaeology of your projects to reflect and express.
That's a nice question. I don't know. I think that's up to the archaeologist, right? I don't know if it's my. Well, I think it's important to be cognizant that a designer, in my opinion, shapes anthropology in some ways, but also in the future allows someone to understand things as archaeology. And in both cases, you're understanding like who we are as people and culture and civilization. And so in the future, I think people are going to find a bunch of these 3D printed pots in the ruins of a site of greater learning in Worcester Hall up on campus. And they're going to wonder, what were people thinking at that time when they were making this, and try to decipher that. And what did that mean? I think they'll make their own interpretations. But I'd like to think that, I guess I'd just like to offer that in the things that you make in the future, that you're cognizant of that power that you have, that the things you do every day leave a footprint, and they leave a lasting footprint about who you were as an individual or who you might be as a society. And I think I'd like to think that archaeologists would say, well, here are some people who were thinking about the good of society and of the planet.
Thank you. So I think we have to wrap up, but there's maybe one more question. Can we do one more question, Paris? Yeah. Okay. Are you okay, Ron?
Yeah. Let's keep going.
All right, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So my question is just right over here. So obviously, like, first of all, fantastic talk. I thought that was very interesting. This, like, building out of clay and mud is obviously very, it's very sustainable, which I appreciate. And I'm just wondering, where because obviously there are a lot of practical limitations and, like, like a lot of laws that kind of prevent you from bringing this to be really big and really almost like regular. But where do you dream of this going? Where do you see as, like, not as an end game, but as where do you see this building in clay and Adobe going throughout the world, or even just, expanding as a more regular thing?
Yeah. So I'll just address something that you said. There are practical limitations and laws. And I would redescribe that as impractical limitations, because there are no practical limitation building Earth. There are 10-story buildings that are 500 years old that are made out of mud, and they're still around. There are embassies and museums and airports made out of mud. So the practical limitations, there are a few. There are laws, and laws in terms of zoning and codes especially are not always designed for safety, but they are made for selling materials. And so nobody has really proven that they can make a lot of money selling something that's free and cheap and available, like mud. But they certainly have in terms of insulation and concrete, and those zoning laws sometimes reinforce in such a way that's selling more of those materials. And so just to clarify, but then you say, well, where is it going? Like, it's already out there. And until like the 1980s or so, like, there were, 3 billion people living or worshiping or storing animals or working in buildings made out of mud around the planet, almost half of the population of the planet. So it's out there. You might not have seen it, but go up to Sonoma, go to Los Angeles, find all the buildings that are made, go to San Francisco, go to all the missions, it's all around us. And it's been othered in a way that architecture can be othered. But go to other countries like Mexico, India, China, where there's 8 billion Adobe houses there. It's out there. So I imagine the future of it is that it can respond to the societies and cultures who aren't using it, who have been distanced from it due to capitalism, and one could be reconnected. And so I think there's two paths for me. I'm interested in the artistic aspect of it and its value there as an experiment and its form and shape, but I'm also interested in it as rediscovering it as a viable form of housing to begin with through this technology. Yeah, thanks for that great question.
one last one real quick.
Thank you for your presentation. It was amazing. So I was going to ask, so I noticed that throughout the presentation, there was this lingering theme of design, these like circular swirling patterns. I was going to ask, like, is there a specific reason for this? And how did you like envision this pattern, this design, before printing it out?
Yeah, that's funny. You know, early on, we were just making cylinders because we were much more interested in the texture. So we weren't making any kind of sculptural form because it was the texture that for us had all this potential. By the time I get to the point where I'm building big things like these, or especially like these, I'm not building big enough for me. And if you have a machine that is like me and rotates around itself, if I have a machine like that, that machine can draw a straight line and it can make a square, but the square is going to be smaller than the circle. So if I want to demonstrate to the world that I can 3D print big, I'm just going to push that machine to print the biggest thing it can. And that's the honest answer about that. And I'm still interested in texture, but I want to show that I can print big, and so I'm maximizing that. If I had a really big machine, I might make other kinds of forms and shapes, but it's kind of a limit that I have and that I'm thinking creatively about how to push it forward. But I'm glad you noticed that. That's nice.
Let's wrap up on that beautiful note and rethink the world from material to the assessment of materials and laws that sort of limit us, and imagine with you a world that is more circular perhaps and more more wavy and as large as it can be, with the least amount of impact and the best amount of outcome and benefit for people. So thank you so much
thank you
for coming.
Greg. Thank you, everyone.
Ronald Rael.